Hello and thank you for tuning in. Today's video I'm gonna show you how I painted a model for a local game store competition. It's a Blood Bowl Ogre from Citadel. Painted this model doing multiple layers, taking my time with special effects, trying to build up a believable look for a model that would play in the mud. So here's the color list. Not all the things that I've used, but most of them. In addition to that, I used mediums and fixers and also some pigments. You saw the model as it looked before priming. For the primer, I decided to use 70605 from Vallejo Surface Primer lineup as a rough brown, because all the tones in the models are gonna be shifted towards a warmer hue, so this warmer color gave me a starting point that I preferred. I decided to start painting the model from the clothes. I used Desert Yellow from the old Citadel lineup as a base tone. I applied multiple thin coats because this color is not very opaque, so it took me about 3 or 4 layers to get a good coverage. But I kept the layers thin so to have a smooth surface for the work that would come after. You can see what I mean when I say that the color is not thick at all. This is the first layer and it seems like I haven't done much on it. I decided to show you this because to me it's one of the biggest mistakes that many people do when they begin painting. It's that they try to achieve the effect with the first brush strokes, but when you're applying thin layers, it's gonna build up over time, it's not gonna be immediate. So after 3 layers, this is how it looks, but I'm still going for another one to get a smoother and more solid coverage. Patience is key. Once a solid base tone was achieved, I moved on to the first shading and I decided to use ARMOUR Brown from Vallejo Model Airline, and I applied it to the recesses to build that initial 3D effect that I need to judge the depth and the volumes of the model. Once again, the color is thin. It's not gonna be fully opaque with your first brush stroke. It's gonna need multiple applications to get a good coverage. Now you can play with this to get a little bit of a transition, but this step is not a precision one and I am not looking for a smooth blending, but I'm just looking for good lights and shadow placement. For a second deeper shadow, I mixed the tank brown with dark sea blue, still Vallejo, and I applied it in the deepest areas of the first shading to increase the contrast between lights and shadows. Here's how the model looked after the first 2 shades were applied on the clothing. You can see there's already the sensation of a 3D effect building up. So I move on to the first light, which is gonna be applied in a textured way. What I mean is that I'm gonna try to replicate the surface of a loincloth, linen. So I imagine it being not a very refined material, so I applied thicker lines, I painted thicker lines with this lighter shade. This pattern is not very complicated. All I did was going straight and across, top to bottom, left to right, following the natural curves of the figure. I didn't keep the lines all the same. I tried to input some variation on the painting of it. So for example, they were thicker and more spaced on the legs and a little bit more refined on the chest area. You need to think about the use that this clothing would have had being worn by an ogre playing basically that football. On camera, I'm already applying a second highlight. I mixed this color, adding more ivory to the previous one. And I decided to touch only a few specific areas to increase the 3D effect that I was building up. After this was done, I decided to smooth it a little bit because the lines were too sharp and the effect was too striking. So I mixed in a color that was in between the base and the first highlight, and I faded all of these lines out together. I also introduced some darker tones for the more hidden areas of the cloths to give it a little bit more shading. Because with all the textures that I've done, it seems like the three-dimensionality that I was trying to build up, so the contrast that I was trying to build, kind of disappeared a little bit. So I brought some of it back, mixing shade color once again and fading it over it. So you can see the result of the clothing as it was done, as it was finished for the moment. Moving on to the skin, Batman's Glow was the base color that I decided to apply all over. As for the tunic, the skin was painted with thin layers. I was trying to keep the surface of the model the smoothest possible. To the risk of repeating myself, I will tell you that the most important thing when you're painting skin, and in general when you're painting lighter colors, is to give the paint the time it needs to dry before applying a following layer. It's so important that when you skip this basic step, you're gonna mess up your paint job and you're gonna see spots and irregularities on the surface that are gonna be very hard to hide in a later stage. So right now I'm applying a first shade on the skin areas. I mixed some of the dark sea blue to the Batman's Glow, and I sketched the shadows on the face and on the arms. The idea is once again to build a contrast. You want to have some personality on the model. You want to enhance what the modeler has sculpted on the surface of the miniature. I decided to mix a lighter tone using white and Batman's Glow, plus I've added a touch of cyan primary blue from Brera My Mary color line, artist color line. This was a very cold pale skin color that I've applied on the more prominent features of the head and the arms, building the character and trying to give it more expression. Although sometimes on small surfaces it might be better to use a thicker paint, when it comes to skin tone I prefer to keep the layers very thin, because I want to be able to preserve the good quality of the surface, to be able to rework, reposition and rethink the placements of lights, shadows, warm tones, cold tones that I'm doing throughout the development of what I am trying to get to, which is very striking expressions on the model. After these initial 2 stages on the skin, I decided to go back and rework some of the areas, lighten them or darkening them according to my taste. Also, I decided to change the size of some of it. So my idea at this point was that an ogre running on a football field trying to crush his enemies with his fist would get some blood flowing. And I decided to represent this by adding warm tones to some areas of his face, especially on the nose and on the cheeks. So you also want to add variation to the skin colors. Adding warm tones and cold tones serves a purpose of making the surface interesting. The different temperature of these areas will also facilitate the eye of the viewer to look towards them and get interested, find it more pleasing to look at. Now on to the part that every miniature painter loves, painting the eye of these little models. Yeah, it's a pain, there is no real trick about it, it's just a matter of practice. You need a sharp brush. The only real advice that I can give you, the recommendation, is that you don't use white or black. Just use the highlight color, the most lighter of the highlight colors that you've used on the skin, and most of the time the darkest shade to the pupil. Those would be more than enough, and they would be more natural looking in the end than white and black. There are definitely many more ways one could have painted the skin tones on a model like this. The basic idea, however, is to keep it interesting and keep a good contrast, so to give character to the miniature. Moving on to the metallics. I decided to apply metallic coats on the model at this stage. I switched to a regular palette, a ceramic palette, and I've also changed the water pot and the brush that I'm using. It's always a good idea to keep your regular acrylics and the metallic acrylics separated from each other, because once you get the flakes flowing through your wet palette or into your blending brush, you're gonna keep on finding them over and over surfaces that you don't want them to be. Theet was applied over all the areas of the model that would become blue. It would work as an undercoat, as a foundation for the layer stage. Then for all the other metallic areas, I decided to apply a base coat of gun gray from Vallejo Model Air. I wanted to get a very smooth finish, so I applied a couple of thin coats to get very solid look. To introduce some contrast over the steel areas, I've applied a thin layer of black ink from Vallejo Game Air. I decided to be deliberate in the application, not going over the entire surface, but instead placing the color in the recesses to increase the contrast, in fact. In this stage, I also take advantage of that little drop that forms at the end of the brush stroke to give the effect of a dent into the metallic plates. Metal is a reflective surface, so I decided to paint on some of these reflections, but in a very approximate way. I basically mixed the warm tone and I've applied it on all of these areas that would have reflected the ground. And later on I'm gonna mix in a cold tone with some blue and place it in all of the areas that would reflect the sky. Creating this illusion, although very subtle, would make the surface interesting, would create contrast, and would also make it look more realistic and natural. You can see that I've introduced some of the magenta into the metallic mix of gun gray and tin bits, and I'm applying it in all of those areas that are facing towards the ground. Now you can see I'm mixing the primary blue, the cyan, into the gun gray, and I am going to apply this in all of the other areas that are facing the sky. To increase the contrast, I mixed a lighter color, used aluminum from Vallejo model hair, and painted it on the edges of these metallic areas. You can create thin lines and small dots with the highlight color on the metal surface to give the illusion of dents and scratches and make the surface overall more interesting. You can see how I'm doing these right now on screen. I decided to apply a glaze of gun gray and tin bits over the metallic areas painted so far to achieve smooth transitions and a little bit of a blending between the tones that I've applied up to this point. Now I moved on to the creation of the undercoat for the blue armor of the model. Back to the areas that I painted with thin bits at the beginning of the metallic work, I decided to introduce some nuances in color using some of the gun gray and other warm tones and cold tones that I had on the palette at the time. This is done because I would make it so that this metallic layer is visible through the scratches that I would create on the blue armor. In addition to the metallic paints, I've also applied a thin layer of aged rust pigments from Forge World. My idea at this point was that an armor worn by an ogre playing deathmatch football would not be particularly clean, new and shiny, but would be something battered and, well, not treated so well. For the weathering effect that I'm trying to get to in the end, this rust will show through the blue of the armor, through the dents in the blue of the armor. And I'm gonna show you how, but here's a trick. I used a pigment fixer from Obscurium to make it so that these rust pigments that I've applied won't move with the following layers of the paint job. If you don't do this, once you get them wet again, they might shift and move and get muddy with all the other shades you're applying on top. Here you can see the final result of the metallic paint job we've done so far. Now on to the blue of the armor. I decided to use P3 Signar blue. Now this is more of a technical step. Here I'm applying a thin layer of Mick Jimenez chipping fluid. Normally you would do this with an airbrush, and then once it's dry, or better as soon as it's dry, you apply your paint with the airbrush as well. But I've done it with the brush because I needed to hit just small surfaces. So as soon as my brush applied layer of the chipping fluid was dried, I applied a thin layer of the blue with the brush. I then quickly mixed a highlight color, adding white to the Signar blue, and applied it on the painted area. Before this highlight color had the chance to dry, I used the loaded brush technique with white to create a quick transition through the extreme light. It's important to be quick to be able to use the chipping fluid properties. Hence the reason why I'm painting just a small plate at a time. I needed to quickly get to a finished look on this particular plate before starting the scratching, hence why I'm applying all of these highlights over the area. Now I'm moving on to the chipping part. So first of all, I'm making sure that the surface is wet with brush, just loaded with water. Then I'm gently touching the surface with this metal tool. I am basically rubbing off some of the painting that, thanks to the fluid that I've applied at the beginning, would chip away and create this realistic looking piece of armor that I'm trying to achieve. I like the fact that this fluid is coming off slowly, little by little, giving me a chance to control some of the placement of the chips that I'm scraping off. I'm using a hair swab to remove the water and to gently clean the area, so to stop the chipping from happening more. With the highlight color, I'm also edge highlighting some of the areas where the paint has come off. I'm highlighting the lower side, the side that will reflect the sky, to really make them pop. I repeated these stages over every single piece of blue armor that I wanted to paint on the model. And here you can see the result that I got at the end of it. It was a long process, but I feel like it was worth it for the result that we got in the end. Now it was time to paint the leather straps on the model. I mixed the base color using flat brown from Vallejo Model Color and cyan from Brera My Mary line. This tone was applied on all the leather straps on the model. Once again, I'm applying thin coats to keep all the texture that the model has on it. There is nothing particular about this stage except the need to be precise not to ruin the work we've done in the other areas so far. I decided to stop working on the leather because I noticed that it would have been harder to reach the padding underneath it after it was painted. So I moved on to paint these. Using darker blue, I applied a base coat. Being the surface of the padding so small, I decided to mix a much lighter tone for the first highlight. You can also apply a thicker paint because the surface is once again so small and the transition needs to be sharp. Also, being the surface so small, it's not a good idea to go over it multiple times because you're exposing yourself to the risk of a rogue brush stroke that will ruin the paint job that you've done in a surrounding area. I pushed the contrast even more, adding more white to the first highlight mix. You can see the very pale gray color. I painted it in a thick way over those edges that I thought would benefit from being pushed a little bit. Looking at the model at this point, I decided that the stripe on the pants needed to be painted in the same color of this padding. So I went back, grabbed the base color and the first highlight color and applied it to it. I then created a pattern of thin lines to create a texture with the second highlight color. Then free-handed a brown stripe to the side to create the look of a Blood Bowl team uniform. I went back to the leather stripes. I used ivory and flat brown to mix the highlight color, which I've applied onto the side of each leather stripe to simulate the weathering and the use that those stripes would have over the course of many games. So you want to paint the lighter tones onto the side, on the edges of the leather stripes. Second highlight color, more ivory than the previous one, and even less of an area touched by the brush. To smooth out the transition a little bit and to increase the deepness of the shadows, I use brown ink, or actually sepia ink, from Vallejo game colors. The shininess of the ink also gives a very natural look to these letter stripes. Now it was time to apply some freehands with the team numbers and the team emblem, the Reikland Riders emblem. So over the areas that would receive these markings, I applied matte varnish, followed by a layer of chipping medium once it was dry. I then took Citadel Celestra Grey and painted the numbers. I decided to go for a Lucky 13 for this ogre. You can see me doing the painting over here. It's not very complicated, it's just number 13. I picked a style from a font that I found interesting and I painted it solid with Celestra Grey. Once I was done, I took a metal tool that I used to sculpt and scraped the surface with this. Thanks to the chipping medium, the paint would flake very easily, revealing some interesting texture for the chipping effect. The paint job on the model is complete. Now it's all about placing this tough guy over the game. So let's move on to the final stage of the tutorial, the base and the web. As you can see, I switched back to my ceramic palette. I've placed some glazing medium mixed with water in one of the spots, and in the others I've placed a random mix of Forge World pigments. I've used all the earth shades, some greens and the rust colors. I am laying down the glazing medium and the water over the base, then I'm mixing in the brush some of the pigments and thickly applying them on the base. I'm also applying the mud in the same way under the shoes, because if this guy was running onto the field, some of it would have stuck to his shoes. Not only I am placing the mud underneath the shoes, but I'm also placing it onto the side of it. Of course, I'm using a thinner layer of paint this time, of pigments, not a thick one. I'm also going as far as reaching up to his ankles and shins with some of these colors, especially with the greens, because the grass would be a little bit higher than the mud itself. Of course, I'm applying some mud on the knee pads, because that would touch the field during the course of the game multiple times and they would get dirty. I'm applying some mud on his butt, because, you know, he would have sat on the grass sooner or later. The trick here is to be random, or as random as possible. Pigments are fairly good for this, because they allow you to move them around even after you've placed them initially. Elbows are another hotspot for stains during a game. Hands, definitely. Also, I'm applying some rust pigments over the balls, over the knuckles of this armor, because, you know, it's an ogre, he won't keep it very oily, shiny and clean. This is the Obscurium pigment fixer. It's mandatory that you use it on the model, otherwise every time you were to touch it, you would move around and they're basically powdery, so they would go away. Final stage is applying some blood. I use a Tamiya Clear Red X27 because it's fantastic. This transparent paint simulates blood very nicely. Final stage is the grass on the base. I mix some PVA glue with the green and brown pigments, splashed it randomly over the base, not over all of the base, but just in some areas, and I gently attach some grass, which I then squished with more pigments and PVA glue to simulate a muddy field of game. And let me say that I'm impressed if you stuck with me all the way through this tutorial. Here's a recap of all the colors that I've used. As I said, it's not all the things that I've used, but here is the model. I think it looks good. I don't know how it's gonna do in the competition. I hope it's gonna show off and take the prize, but who cares? Really, all it matters was having fun painting it, and I hope you had too watching it. See you next time!